Good morning. My name is Laurie Moy. I am the Communications Director for Global Broadband and Innovations Program. It's an ICT4D initiative here at EGAT. We have two main thrusts. One is to extend connectivity out beyond the rural edge, and then the second is to apply that connectivity in efficient and effective ways. And in order to help promote that, we have these monthly Tech Talk series aimed at helping implementers and the aid community better understand ICT4D and how it can be used effectively and efficiently. So I'm pleased to present Tim Unwin, who's the new CEO of CTO, to talk about partnerships.
CTO or CEO.
Partnerships in ICT4D, a little bit about what makes them work, what makes them tick, and who benefits from them. So,
thanks so much for inviting me. This is meant to be, I gather, very informal, and it's more of a sort of thought-provoking and taking you through how some of my ideas on this have developed. I was, of course, having just taken over at CTO and wanting you guys all to be involved in our work. I was just going to do a hard-pitch sell on the CTO. I have those slides afterwards if you want, but I've been around a little bit longer than the last 6 months, and I guess that this is sort of the story. In the early 2000s, I was absolutely passionate about partnerships, going to be really the way to go and how things change. I think, got very disillusioned and basically argued, I think, that partnerships weren't really in the interest of the poor and the marginalised at all. And if we could go down the conspiracy route, and I still feel that quite a lot, I'm now trying to get some kind of rational agreement about bringing those together. And I've got some questions that I haven't resolved in my own mind, but some pretty good ideas about how we can do these things better. So as a sort of starting point, if the title was about interests, I just picked up when I was preparing this a bit in the Hindu, in the promiscuous world of international relations, elements of a strategic partnership, and I just love their faces. There is such good body language there, and like in any personal relationship with boyfriend, girlfriend, partner, whatever, there are always interests in any kind of partnership. And I guess one of the messages I want to take away from this is that as long as we're transparent about those interests as far as possible, and everybody's open and clear, and people who want to buy in inverted commas, to the partnership, and they're aware of what others will take out of it, then I think that can get around some of the moral challenges and difficulties. So broadly, what I want to do, and I'm going to keep it quite short because it's much more fun to have a discussion. I sort of think, I've been around partnerships for quite a long time now, as the grey hair shows, but going back into the origins of public-private partnerships, I think understanding where they came from, why they emerged as they did, is really, really important for understanding why there are fundamental problems still with them today. So if the first message to take away is transparency, a second is we've got to stop using the word public-private partnerships and start talking about multi-stakeholder partnerships. You'll understand why that is. And those who still use PPPs have very specific interests for doing so. And I think that's something we should be cautious of. And so I have lovely rows with friends in the bank who love the word PPP, and they use it for what I think are essentially contractual relationships. Then I want to talk a little bit about some of the key success factors, and come back at the end to this question. So picture here in Rwanda, trying to get some agreement and a joined up strategy for ICT in the education sector, and everyone of course signed up to it, but there was a little deal being done on the side with another provider, and the permanent secretary was going to get some benefit out of it, and the company was going to get some benefit out of it, and of course the schools were going to get benefit out of it, but it was totally separate for anything we were doing in trying to get it joined up. A little bit about my background. Far too long as an academic, but still really an academic at heart. But as you probably are aware, this has been recorded, isn't it? So successive governments in the UK destroyed British higher education, and I felt I couldn't any longer do the sort of research and teaching that I wanted to do in academia. So I was going to retire to do the sort of work that I wanted to do, and I was asked when that was discovered to take over at CTO. I'm not going to say very much about that still because we could talk about that afterwards. But my background was very much in rural development, so interests here. I cut my teeth in Bihar, in what was then South Bihar in the 1970s, working on periodic marketing systems. But an interest always in technology. I used to program in Fortran, in learning and particularly in critical theory. And like many of my ideas, if any of you are familiar with Jürgen Habermas's work, German social theorist, he's had a big influence on my work. But in the early 2000s, I was asked to lead Tony Blair's Infundo initiative, so a lot of my practical experience began there, which was ICT partnerships education in Africa. I had the sort of privilege of leading the World Economic Forum's Partnership Education initiative with UNESCO, so drawing some of that experience. And then last year, or a year and a half ago, we were asked to do the systematic review for DFID on partnerships in ICT4D. So this is actually, believe it or not, the first time I've presented some of the findings of that. As you're probably, actually I don't, are you aware that DFID is doing all these systematic reviews across different areas of activity? Very much it's a medical model. Chris Whitty, who's taken over as head of research there, believes that actually you can use the sort of systematic review model that's used in medicine to actually study all aspects of development. And I think our work on this suggests that that is a little bit problematic, but we could talk about methodologies later.
So Tim, just for a minute, this is the US. We don't even know where DFID is. So if it's not USAID, we're not following
okay,
it.
but we're your friends. Okay, little story. Little story. When I was leading thank you for the idea. When I was leading Infundo, which was based within DFID is the UK's Department for International Development, in case they're really illiterate here. And I would work with anybody who shared interests. And so I worked with JICA in Ghana, that's the Japanese, in case you're not aware, and also with USAID in Ghana. And even though USAID was sort of still tied aid and purely in the interests of US capital, as I've often been told by people in USAID, we were willing to work together and do some exciting things. But then just this year, and I think if you want a much more detailed view or understanding, this was where I was going to link to the internet. But the World Economic Forum asked me to work with Alex Wong on a complete review of all the global education initiatives from 2003 to 2011. And that's now a 60-page report just published on March the 7th, which is up on their site. So that has really a lot. So and the words there were we just did a map of all the words in our DFID review, and that's what it came up with, which can tell you a little bit. Okay, so much for sort of background. Back in, some of us are old enough to remember the 60s, yeah, just about. Life was simple. There was the state, there was private sector, there wasn't even really civil society. There may be some NGOs and churches, but things were easy. But then with the overthrow of the Soviet Union, the world changed, and I've written lots about this. I'm sure you're familiar with some work, but two things really coalesced: economic growth and liberal democracy. And this was going to change the world. It was somehow going to make the world a better place. And in terms of some of the things that were happening, particularly in Europe, and I know we're the other side of the pond and completely insignificant and a load of communists. And, we really, the thought of having a national health service that's free is just, well, we do actually have one. It works reasonably. Anyway,
that's socialism. Welcome to
America. It's communism, not socialism. I mean, you have a right-wing president at the moment. No. Anyway,
you don't know how
click.
how un-right-wing our current president is.
I thought he was no. Anyway, and so people after '91 were very much Tony Giddens and others trying to create this third way and come up with simply the best of what had happened in the Soviet Union and the best of capitalism. But it wasn't quite as simple as that. Because we were in post-Thatcher and post-Reagan here. I remember a world where actually taxation was a good thing, and you were taxed to do good things in the world, and that all changed. So it's now impossible to argue for that. You've got to have a low-tax world, therefore you've got to generate income to do the sorts of things that the state would do. And so in the 90s, particularly led by the UK, and it's actually remarkable how few PFI, if you look at the figures, how few PFI initiatives private finance initiatives took off really over here, and I think that's quite an interesting difference given the advocacy for partnerships that has come subsequently here. But the government saw it as being let's attract private finance into public infrastructure, building schools, building roads, etc., etc. That's often said, but what's often not said is that it was partly also done for risk-sharing purposes. And if you look at the early PFIs, they were about sharing the risk. And again, I know very little work that's been done on partnerships and risk that it would be worth following up later. So between 1990 and 2009, the European Commission talks about there were 1,340 PFI partnerships. And I don't know, I haven't got the figures for the US. But quite simply, if that was working in Europe, just as the Washington Consensus, here we are, was going to solve macroeconomic policy instruments and was going to solve that part of development, why shouldn't PFI initiatives, why shouldn't public-private partnerships work also for development? And I think that rhetoric was really, really strong in Europe. And it came through also in the, obviously, we'll come back to it, with the MDG 8, which is the catch-all MDG, Target F, which was specifically about ICTs and partnerships. And I'd love to know how that got in there. I've been trying to track back who the key individuals were and actually getting that in place, and I haven't been able to, so if anyone here knows that. But I would argue again that then became a point when the world was focusing on MDGs. That was a key thing that meant that ICT4D partnerships were going to be the rhetoric for the next decade or so. And we can think of what were these early ICT for development, or actually I haven't put ICT4 development there, just ICT development. And I think if we look at it, most were absolutely public-private. And when I was asked to lead Mfundo in the early 2000s, it was explicitly said to be a public-private partnership. And the way these things happened, John Chambers, CEO of Cisco, was going around many different governments trying to get initiatives up off the ground. Whether it was sort of in part on the back of the Millennium Declaration, I don't know. But he was encouraging lots of people, the World Economic Forum, and persuaded Tony Blair, and that's how it happened, and his cabinet, to actually create this way which ICT could be used for education in Africa with partnerships. And there were lots of things like that. If we look back, these were completely under-theorised. Nobody read anything about partnerships. Maybe there wasn't a lot of partnership there, but it wasn't even embedded in any kind of overall theoretical framework through which partnerships could be considered. And I'm looking at that camera again. But just to show how sort of simplistic and naive we were at the time. You may remember, well, you probably won't, because it doesn't matter what happens in Europe. But when Tony Blair came to power, one of the big things in 1997 was we're going to have an ethical foreign policy. So when I joined DFID in 2001, I asked, can I see the ethical foreign policy? Can I actually see the ethical statements in DFID that you use to make judgments? So I need that if I'm meant to be crafting partnerships. So we were challenged by our number 10, which is like your White House, to do, but a bit smaller, to implement this and to be doing development in new ways. And they looked at me as I was stark staring mad and said, ethical foreign policy. So I actually wrote the ethical framework through which we could do this, which was signed off by Secretary of State and became the ethical framework for deciding, because we had to decide which companies we would work with. Were we going to work with tobacco companies? You're about to say something? No.
Funny enough, last Friday, as part of the VSO board, so that crazy British organization, I'm on the board, just a shocking thing to me. We actually ratified our ethical partnership activities. So, funny enough, they were talking about, it came out of DFID as the model for what they do, because we don't have these kind of concepts.
I've had influence!
Yes! A decade later, it's still happening.
2 decades later.
Oh, that's true.
No, it's not this one. But actually, I'm not going to get through this in half an hour, speed up. Also, almost no empirical experience. And another, it's a remarkable thing, we all keep reinventing the wheel.
Oh, we keep reinventing the flat tire.
Okay. and the wood, well, the wooden structure even inside it before the tire is put on it. But again, I think there are very real. If we've got time to talk about it, I think there are very real interests why that is. Because people don't want to admit they're learning from us, and particularly my work's in ICT4D. There are lots of these new partnerships for education initiatives, and we could talk about. So there are even interests there. I'm going to speed up.
By the way, that's why we started Fail Fair.
Yes.
So to actually talk about our failures.
Yeah, but it's and there are issues around anyway. But no, I think talking about failures is a little different from being willing to learn from others, because you can talk about failure and still not be willing to learn from it.
First step is admitting you failed, eh? That's before you can even actually learn from it.
Can I go over my half an hour? We started like, so one of my challenges, if anyone's again got the answer to this, I said I was a boring academic. I've always wanted to, people learn more by their mistakes, so I wanted to design assessments for my students that they would get more if they didn't pass, so more if they failed. Because everything's about learning and regurgitating accepted truth. Anyway, so, right, each of these is, and yeah, again, I've touched on that when I talked about Chambers' work, but, and I actually think that people denigrate WSIS hugely, and certainly things that happen afterwards. But it was the first UN summit that actually had the private sector actively involved. And so the ways in which the private sector was, in a really substantial way, engaged in that, I think had significant implications for the future. Anyway, just point being, I think, do we recognise the lady on the left? Or the lady on the right?
Sorry, unless they're on daytime TV, we don't recognize them in the US.
On the left, and her name, mine was your Secretary for Education, under...
we wouldn't remember that.
Yeah.
No, okay. She's really, really nice. Spelling.
Oh, okay.
And Hoda Baraka, who led the Egyptian deputy minister in Egypt and did all their ICT4D thing. But yeah, that's really lasting impact. So I think it's worth just reflecting why ICT4D particularly has been in partnerships. We've touched on some of the reasons, but I think there are other sort of practical and technical ones we could go through. Actually, they're hugely difficult to do. None of us have all that knowledge together. And again, you have your techies and your rural development people, your techies and your educationists, and they don't speak the same flipping language. So how can you expect the private sector and governments to speak the same language? So I think diverse skill sets are required, and more so than in some other areas. We have to say that most government officials haven't got a clue, and are still actually quite sceptical. And there's a real tension here that I don't know in USAID, but certainly in DFID and many European donor agencies, it's a fairly left-wing people in the donor agencies, and so they have a pathological dislike for anything that smacks of the private sector. That's a huge difficulty to get over. I mean, I remember just 4 or 5 years ago, well, no, 3 or 4 years ago, when we had meetings here in Washington to bring the private sector and donors together. Actually, the most important thing was just getting them to interact and try and understand the same language, and not realising that they're poles apart. So if we're going to do it, we need to have this. I think we have to accept that ICT sector's been driven by globalisation and its role in that, and again, we could talk about lots of things. Not a lot of time on it, but the distinction between the CSR side, which is very often what's involved in these partnerships, and the business end. And I'm completely convinced that actually there's no point in CSR at all. You want to work the business end of an organisation because they know about sustainability. It's not just giving stuff away. And I've touched on the formalising role of WSIS, which I think, as I said, is more important than is often said. If I hadn't got sidetracked, I'd have said a lot more about this. There are many different models of partnership, and I just want to highlight two extremes. Again, if you know about, one is very much the circular model, which is by the partnering initiative. Ross Tennyson, are you familiar with her work? And it's all about the partnering cycle. All these elements are important, but it begins sort of moving on, and it's all about creating the partnership. And I think that is really important, because many partnership initiatives, much training on partnerships, is about keeping the partnership alive. But do we need to do that for development? In whose interest is it for a partnership to survive. Surely, a counter-argument is you have a partnership to deliver a development outcome, and then you can close the partnership down. There's no need for the partnership still to survive.
Well, you can say that in theory, but I think a lot of times what happens is, as with any organization, there's a whole lot of work that goes into building the partnership. So once you have it, it's much easier to repurpose it for something than to go through the process of creating another one for another purpose. So
but my comment would be invariably, and forgive me, but I think to the extent you've illustrated, it's about keeping the partnership going primarily, rather than necessarily delivering the development impact.
Right.
And it, that's not always the case. And if you do retool it to keep on focusing on development, but the sort of thing I'm suggesting is that the focus of that is primarily about keeping the partnership. In contrast with some linear models, such as Tom Cassidy's model here for the global education issue, which was totally focused on delivering an output and or outputs on out, whether we call them outputs, outcomes, whatever. Let's not get involved in that debate. But this kind of model, and people denigrate linear models and prefer the circular models. But actually, in terms of outcomes, this might be better. But that was good. So, why did we then have this shift to multi-stakeholder partnerships, which I would encourage us to use?
Tim, sorry, what was the linear model?
Tom Cassidy. Right, this is Tom Cassidy's model based on the ICT education in the Global Education Initiative of the World Economic Forum. Can I'm not going to get through, but I'm very happy to come back and clarify, because we need. And those models kind of often led to a one-size-fits-all approach. Ross Tennyson, for example, the IBLF, International Business Leaders Forum, is one of the most used models of partnerships out there. And she argues very strongly that those principles apply across the board. And I think one of the things we've been doing recently is comparing health partnerships with education partnerships, with rural development partnerships, arguing that they are fundamentally different. And actually, you can do things in health that you can't do in education. But that's again something we could talk about in more detail in the discussion. Public-private partnerships per se are widely seen as having generally failed in practice, and very often that's because they don't involve civil society. They don't actually formally engage other partners, and so I would argue very strongly that if we're going to make these partnerships successful, they need to be much more diverse than the originally conceived public and private. Although there are huge debates about the nature of civil society, and when I was working at the forum, we commissioned someone to do a key report for us, and she was absolutely adamant that civil society should be included within the private realm. There's no such thing as separate civil society. So you really have public-private, and we get into public goods and all the rest of the debates around that. But I certainly would argue strongly that we do need to consider civil society. And fundamental criticism, the next slide is actually about, do you know Jens Martin's work on this? Because if you don't, really strongly recommend it. He's highly critical of partnerships in the best sense. So civil society, and for the work we do in ICT4D, it's absolutely essential. We cannot leave civil society out if we want to have effective outcomes. And so I said at the beginning, some friends in the bank still talk about PPPs when I think they're actually talking about contractual arrangements. They agree, but still call them PPPs, which I don't think they are. So go around in sea circles. And I think I would want us to be focusing much more on MSPs.
So before we go on, so the difference between an MSP and a PPP is an MSP includes CSOs.
Particularly, but also others, and it has a conscious place for international organisations, UN, bilateral donors as well, which complicates the issue. But fundamentally, yes.
Okay.
It's not just the public and the private. And you'll see why in terms of interests at the end. I'll come back to it. Jens argues that actually many of the partnerships that have been introduced are exclusively in the interest of the private sector. And those are, I think, 8 key risks he points out. And effectively he's arguing that the private sector, through this partnership rhetoric for development, is fundamentally changing the rules of international governance and you can, again, that's going back in the private sector role in WSIS as well, and that is unhealthy. And you can see all this, and I think all of us could probably point to things where each of those apply. And one of the biggest challenges I've faced is the second one of those sort of, if you have a partnership and you're forced to use people in that partnership, you might actually use someone who's third rate and isn't the best for delivering because you've got a partnership agreement. And getting around that bind is really tricky. But it's something I've had to face 2 or 3 times in the past, and my bosses, now I'm the boss, so I can do what I like, but my boss said, you must use this partner. And I said, I don't want to, but you have to because they are a partner. And I knew they were going to deliver a rubbish product, and they did. So I think, but we could drill down on all of those, but strongly recommend you look at that. So, not much longer. So I'm not reading it all, am I? Let me off, yeah. Okay, so in the review we did for DFID, and I don't think these are going to come as at all surprising, so I'll go through them quickly. But there were sort of 5 key areas of things that one had to be successful if one was going to make them have a development outcome. The local content and local stakeholders involved, and particularly that's local private sector and local civil society. You've got to focus to begin with on development outcomes. And most partnerships actually don't necessarily do that. Are we familiar with the NEPAD Schools initiative?
I was wondering when you mentioned it.
I'm trying to be good. Okay, so we all know, but I'll come back to that. Got to focus on scalability and sustainability from the start. And again, anyone can make a pilot project work, and the private sector says, yeah, but the government's not putting enough money in it to make it go to scale. We've shown it worked. Go to scale. But hey, it was never designed to go to scale. It should be built at the beginning at scale, and should have sustainability from the start. Giving every kid a $200 laptop isn't exactly sustainable. But we won't get.
Only if you drop them out of a helicopter.
Yeah, I've got that. That's tomorrow's talk. And it's amazing they don't break. I mean, it really is fantastic. We've touched on some of these, but there are sort of 5 key things you have to have there: trust, honesty, openness, mutual understanding, and respect. Which is tough. I mean, it's easy to trip those off the tongue, but it's really tough to do. How are you going to get civil society to agree to work with a corrupt government and a private sector company just interested in making money, and the civil society organisation leaders also want to make lots of money, so they siphon it off? Now, I'm parodying. This is not what I really believe. Again, often there has to be that supportive wider ICT environment. If that's not in place, you're not going to be able to implement things. So we all know about the schools projects where they're going to put PCs into schools and they then realise they didn't have any electricity. But much more important for me is actually the challenges with doing this whole DFID review. There are very, very few good evaluations out there. We looked at hundreds of grey literature, published literature. There's very, very little good evaluation in this area. So we don't actually know enough about whether partnerships make a difference.
I would say that because most partnerships are highly political with very high profile stakeholders, you will never have a really good evaluation because no one wants to mention the bad things.
Yeah, but some of us, the key thing of this book that we've just done for the GEI is the only reason I agreed to do it was if I could say the bad things. Now, you might not see many bad things in the final report that was written, but they're there if you read between the lines. Secondly, though, diversity of methodologies. Nobody's using the same M&E methodologies, so it's actually very, very difficult to compare what's going on. Almost nobody does proper baseline studies, so it's very difficult to say anything about impact or outcomes. I think this is what you're saying, much wish fulfillment. The political thing is, this is what we want to show, so we will show it because we have to be seen as being good. Not enough attention paid to unintended consequences. And different partners have different success criteria. And this is why I'll go back to NEPAD and the eSchools. Yeah, I think everyone will widely agree the eSchools initiative was a complete failure, although even the report that was done for Infodev was polite about that. But many people said it was a great success. I remember talking to a very senior manager in the private sector who said, I was saying, look, it hasn't led to educational improvements, it's not being rolled out more widely, it's a failure. That was stupid. It was a complete success for us. We got everything we wanted out of it. It got us to know the ministers and the people involved, so we could. So the different, coming back to the theme, interests involved. I think very quickly some of the challenges that our work in the GEI showed, and they build out of this. But how do we get long-term sustainability? We all underestimate the difficulty in reaching those common goals and agreement on what to do in the first place. Everyone wants to get on with the initiative rather than spending time in getting that agreement. We failed in that to some extent. How do we balance the different interests? Stakeholders, the need to determine the levels of contribution from each partner right at the beginning and not keeping renewing that. Actually knowing what resources we're going to need in 2 years' time so that can be built in. Essential to have that cooperation between the national bodies and the private sector. All too often the private sector goes in, we can do this, government is useless, we'll do it for you, and M&E left to the end. So, coming towards a conclusion, if I had to summarise what is important for being successful, you've got to have a high-level leadership. You have to have a trusted and knowledgeable partnership broker. And in this space, there are very, very few of us out there who are doing that. And that's, so I've been very good and not said much about CTO, but that is absolutely where the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organisation is putting itself. The World Economic Forum has very moved away from that space, and this is something that our new strategic plan, recently accepted by Council, is very much going to be focusing on, drawing on all this experience. I've said it before, but we've got to start with the intended development outcomes. Far too often the ministries are not sufficiently involved, and it means it takes longer, but they're the ultimate owners of these major partnership initiatives if they're going to be successful. And so we have to work with them despite the frustrations that many people would say are in there. There aren't that many good project managers. There are some, undoubtedly, who make these work, but a coherent project management system, I'm not going to say there's a standard model, best practice. I don't believe in best practice. There are lots of good practices that we need to draw on for each context. Adequate resourcing has to be there. Ultimately, most partnerships fail because of insufficient resourcing, and even where there's a high-level leader, the high-level leader can often lever additional resources. So the CEO says, we have to make this work, money will go into that. But just the mechanisms through which that happens through governments and through the private sector are tough. That tension between consistent strategy and flexible delivery. Again, people I don't think look in enough detail at that. You've got to have a basic overall strategy. You've got to enable people to move around flexibly within it to achieve it. And there has to be good comms. And again, out of those of you involved in partnerships, how much time do you actually spend talking about internal and external communication? I would suggest probably not enough. So, finally, in whose interests? And obviously the answer is everybody has interests, and we need to be transparent and open about them. So private sector interests, governments have interests. Let's not forget getting re-elected. And there's actually only a tiny window in a government cycle when you can do things effectively. So actually being very, very clear about when that is and making it happen, how you engineer that. Civil society, huge interests in being involved. Very often we'll be critical. Of course we recognise the classmates up there. And donors have huge interests as well. So everybody has different interests. And the fundamental question then, and I don't know the answer to that, and it worries me, and I struggle with it. So if actually the private sector, in a monetary term, gets most out of a partnership, but it actually has had a development outcome, maybe that's not so bad after all. And how do we go about resolving them? And I think this is the last slide. Transparency throughout. I can't go on enough about that. I think that's the message come through. Particularly about those interests. And if it's done creatively and well, people say nobody will tell you the truth. I don't believe that. I've had some really, really good workshops where we've been able to bring people together to share interests, to get the... Because if we don't share interests, there will be no trust. If the civil society doesn't trust governments, doesn't trust private sector, it's like you can't have mediation if people don't want mediation to take place. You can't force people together. So the necessary preconditions for a partnership have to be in place. We then have to, and again, you may be familiar with my own work on this, I think if we structure it in terms of supply and demand, now what are the resources that are needed, who's willing to contribute what? And just recently, I mean, it's really interesting that a paper I wrote 10 years ago is now being used as a basis for a new initiative happening in East Africa, which I've now been invited to be involved in, which really systematically tries to implement this. So, you know, we'll see if it's a success. Again, absolutely necessary to get that shared agreement on development objectives. That's all too often rushed, and all too often, that can take 6 months. And particularly the private sector, you know, with its quarterly accounting mechanisms, that's far too long. But if you don't get actually agreed objectives, you're not going to have it working. And there has to be clear allocation of financial resources and throughout managing expectations. So that was 34 minutes from when I started. I'm sorry, I rushed it towards the end. But I sort of shared ideas, that sort of thing you asked me to do. I can drill down, you know, if you want to see all the sort of frameworks, things like that, I can do that. But I think probably I couldn't find a good photograph of USAID with the flag there as well. So this is, as you can see, from Turkmenistan. But where it's not my original photograph, so I've given the credit. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of my problems. If you've got answers to, I hope I've raised some difficult questions, and I look forward to the response.
So as someone who's been in a number of these partnership creation or partnership, let's create a partnership, and it's always been PPPs, which is always kind of a funny one. Whenever I'm in these, I wait for the money moment. I think we've all probably been to the money moment where the government actors are so excited and they're in the room, the corporate actors are so excited and they're in the room, and you realize...
Sorry, I
what?
forgot. You need your tip, I forgot.
Oh, no, and the government actors express their great appreciation that the private enterprise is going to donate or give or support this activity. And the private enterprise takes a moment and says, well, wait a minute, actually we thought this was a great opportunity for us to sell you all our products and services. And the money moment is when they realize that neither actor in the room was the one bringing the money in, and they were both expecting the other. Mm-hmm. So that to me is always the quiet moment at the beginning of a partnership and the test of whether that's going to actually go to the next level or not.
Absolutely, and that's why I put this in. It goes right back to those beginnings in the early 90s and even before that, where it was very much seen as government saw the private sector as purely bringing money. And it is quite unbelievable how you can still go around in this day and age. Should we switch that off now? Or no, leave it on, but I'll be polite. As the
they're going to buy our stuff.
Yes, exactly. So you've got it on both those sides. I have, and the idea is you will do a little pilot project. It goes back to what I was saying about scale and sustainability. You'll do a little pilot project, and the government's going to come in. Now,
the other guy is going to pay for it.
It's going to get worse, or that's what donors are for. So the private sector expects USAID, DFID, CEDA, whatever, to provide the money for the government to buy all the kit, which is why they go. And I mean, our GI paper talks very explicitly about that. That it's been cut a little bit, so it's a little less explicit. But it gets more challenging now. So I'm just thinking how to choose my words on this one, because I think some major global corporations, many of which are based in this country, are actually getting fed up with having done lots of these small initiatives in that expectation, and then find that the government goes to big companies in other parts of the world who, for various reasons, get the contracts, and the big US corporations don't. And they are very angry about that. Now, you could say there's a degree of naivety on all sides, but one of the things we're going to do in the CTO, because we have the links with the private sector, but also very good links with government, with 54 countries that are our members. And we are going to be convening a small series of workshops where you get 5 ministers, 3 CEOs together and actually thrash these issues out and say, right, what can we do about it? And I think we have to be clearer, but it's the private sector has clear interests in doing this and being involved in it. We should be upfront about it. That we will do a pilot project. But I mean, I actually, in another life, I'm completely against pilot projects, and almost came to saying that in the formal presentation. You've got to do it at scale. We know what works, and it's utterly ridiculous that we're still doing partnerships to put computers in schools when we should be kitting out complete. There's 38 teacher training colleges in Kenya and 28 or something in Ghana. We know how to kit them out. We know how to use reasonably well ICTs for teacher professional development. No, but nobody's doing that. There is still no, as far as I know, major teacher training initiative that is at that scale. People are still putting computers in schools. Crazy. Yes, sorry.
So you say that...
Could you give me, I don't know who you all are, so just in terms of so I can answer who you are and where you're coming from.
I'm in the EGAT Bureau and the ICT team.
Okay. Great.
And the scars to prove it.
My eyes are back.
So you say that the private industry is pissed off at the pilot programs and then it's sort of going nowhere because the larger contract down the line goes someone else. So they're either pissed off at the government, the local governments, because they're not buying their product, or they're pissed off at the donors saying, hey, look, we came into partnership with you because we
and even more so with the other companies.
So yeah, of course, their competition. So, and I can understand that, but I would say that the local governments would be saying, well, if we could handle it ourselves, we wouldn't have donors and private sector coming in and giving us stuff. The donors would say, well, if we could go it alone like we did decades ago, we wouldn't need the private sector. Right? So you're right, this triangulation of everyone is looking in the same direction, so they're just going around in circles. How does chambers of commerce come into play here? I think that I don't see chambers of commerce being used in these partnerships to the level that they could to help these communication lines.
I think that's very valid, particularly, I could drill down later, but particularly in involving, one of the really good partnerships, one of the best impacts is when one brings international corporations together to support local enterprise and local private sector development. That's a key place where chambers of commerce can come in and have a great role to play. Whether one includes some people, I think, would include chambers of commerce almost under civil society. Others as straight private sector. And the way they function, the role they play is different. But absolutely, I completely agree that they have a key role to play.
Yeah, because I'll just take the U.S. government example. The U.S. government, through Department of State and the Embassy, is involved in the AmChams.
Yep.
And then the AmChams have connections, and they meet regularly with the local chambers of commerce. So I just see that as a big gap.
I think others
for
things
and
like
setting expectations.
Rotary, International Rotary, that they do a lot of work, and I think some of the things that they've been involved in as well in terms of mediating. Yeah, absolutely.
And setting expectations out.
Yeah.
From the
I think they can play a broker. I think often chambers of commerce are not trusted by all civil society organisations. So having this idea of a separate broker who is trusted and experienced and knowledgeable, few and far between, but to me is absolutely essential. And I think in some instances chambers of commerce can play that, but it shouldn't be the ministry, it shouldn't be the private sector. And I think it shouldn't be civil society. And people like to think that civil society is holy and good. I think we've all grown up out of that and realise it's just as unholy and bad as any other collective entity. Go on.
All right, I got another one for you.
Thank you.
If NEPAD was, I'm going to say NEPAD was one of the more spectacular partnership
stories.
crash and burns, what is one that we could look to that's actually working or worked, that we could say is a success, or at least a not a complete failure from the outside perspective?
I'm often asked that, and I always say I have difficulty in identifying any, and then everyone comes, which is partly deliberate, everyone comes back and comes up, but I know this one, and I know that one, and I know that one. So I think, actually, let's see if this works. Again, much of my work's particularly been, do you think this is going to work, in education. And so what we tried to do in Partnerships for Education, yes, which the UNESCO site takes forever to load.
So there was a UNESCO partnership that was actually
with
successful?
the World, no, the World Economic Forum.
That was really stressing.
You're doubting it, aren't you?
The World Economic Forum with UNESCO, we did this Partnerships for Education programme, which was specifically about identifying successful education partnerships, many of which had ICT4D in. And we developed this website which lists them all, and lessons and experiences. And I don't know anyone who's done that for other sectors, so there are sort of partnerships for, oh my hat.
That looks very fun.
Ah, here we are. But if you, it's, and you can go to, so let's try this, tell me, partnership type, no, but we could, let's say just have, so those are game 3, education level we could take, let's say secondary education, let's just see if it comes up. Yeah, well,
technical difficulty.
To show you how, well, it's really interesting because I used to own this, and this was our site, and then I sold it to the World Economic Forum for nothing, and of course it now goes to this. So it just shows, you know, how things pass on, like the dot force. But anyway, so how sad. But there are. I think there have been some in some aspects of the Chilean Enlaces program, which was ICT for Education, have been very good. I think some. There's huge debate about the impact of. Do you know the Indian? Some of the work being done to have telephone services for Indian farmers, and depending how you account the business models on those, some people say they're very successful. Others say actually the business models don't add up, because and I can see both sides of that. The one of the best used to be the. Sorry, mine's gone. There was the. Which was the, in India, there was a health, local health provided by private sector in traditional medicine. There was an initiative there that I think in the mid-2000s everyone thought was a great success, but has since collapsed. And I think it was a success because the private sector was putting money into it, and that wasn't what they accounted for. So this issue of sustainability. I think. We were talking about the Philippines. I think some aspects of the Escuela project have been, but I wouldn't call that necessarily a public-private partner or a multi-stakeholder partnership. So one of the challenges in doing our paper was finding, which is why I had that side. Defining what is successful is a challenge, and then finding any that are any good is.
Because I think going back to your challenge that you had at the end about if development outcomes are achieved, does it matter if benefits are unevenly distributed? I think the answer is benefits are always unevenly distributed. I mean, if you go to the NEPAD example, as you were talking about, some people in it felt it was a great success. In fact, NEPAD helped start Invenio back in the day. It was one of their rallying points, but it wasn't necessarily a success overall in our activity with it. So, in that sense, I think we have to say that it's always unevenly distributed. The question is, do these ICT4D partnerships or do a lot of these development partnerships actually achieve the development outcomes to begin with?
And I'm just trying to, if we can get this up. Again, what we did, this one, I mean, there are, I can't remember what the 60 final ones we worked on. Part of the problem in answering that question is, as again I think I said, where's the list of the ones we did? Everyone defines success in slightly different ways.
Right.
So it's not possible systematically to answer your question.
Of what is a successful partnership? Yes.
So these were the main ones we finally came on. And again, that itself is interest laden. So how you yourself alluded to the fact that you were I changed it to wishful thinking. So you're actually defining the outcomes in terms of what you want them to be without any systematic way of externally evaluating. I mean, if you don't do, okay, take the OLPC initiatives in Ethiopia. Everyone familiar with OLPC? But there are two different sets of reports that have been written. One which is based very much on short drop-in and doing quick questionnaires and talking, and actually they're getting some educational measures and then educational measures at the end. That apparently shows it's successful. Others, based on long-term interviews and embedded within the schools, shows it hasn't changed a thing at all. And if anything, what's changed is you can't have. There are very, very few proper counterfactuals here, which is part of the challenge. And it was put to me, and I've sort of, probably it's come through in this, but about 8 years ago, the Minister of Education in India said, Tim, if we put all this money that we're putting into computers into something else, how do you know that that wouldn't be more effective? And we don't. We really don't. And what we do know is that if you put a new initiative into a school, almost whatever it is, that will have a positive impact on learning. So a lot of the impact of putting computers, or what India's now planning with our cash into schools, is that kids have actually been shown, gosh, somebody cares about us. So it's really difficult, and so we need good baseline studies. We need clear definition of what the development happens. And people are more interested in creating. That goes back to saying creating the partnerships using this IBLF model. That governments want to be. I mean, if you're, you may have read in newspapers that in the UK our present government has got in a little difficulty because donors have been told by a person who was given Tories, getting money for the Tories, that they can have access to policy with the Prime Minister if they pay six-figure sums. I'm sure that doesn't happen in any other parts of the world. It's unique to us. But both there's a cosy coalition of interest. Sorry, yes, you had your hand up.
Well, I was going to kind of piggyback. You mentioned a lot of things about monitoring and evaluation.
Yeah.
And I come from a recent grad school where randomized control trials are pushed pretty heavily as far as figuring out the social impact of something. So is that something, without you saying it directly, is that something that you'd like to see greater?
Absolutely, much more, yeah. And we've been, we actually, and it's something quite a lot of my PhD students have been working on, and there are lots of it. And actually, but deciding what the metrics are. And again, this is pushing it too far, but part of me feels that you can actually almost prove anything you want to with monitoring and evaluation, depending on how you ask the questions. And if you're so constrained in your thinking by a set of institutionalized, interest-laden metrics, you're going to start repeating it. It's getting outside the box and thinking. We touched on fail-fare and unintended. I'm a great believer in you've got to be able to pick up the unintended consequences. But no, absolutely.
Do you see any pushback if you had suggested this to people? Say, well,
yes. Again, I mean, anecdotes. I'll never forget. SchoolNet Africa. Do people remember? someone I really respected there, not Shafika, but somebody else, working in South Africa. I know, because we were saying M&E is so important. He said, Tim, we apply for lots and lots of funding,
Yep.
and we put in M&E, they always take out the M&E. It's ridiculous. It is so central to anything we do, which I hope it came through on one of my slides. If it didn't, I apologise. But I completely. But how it's done with a different hat on. Seeing that, I'll be polite. Yeah, I'm chair of the Commonwealth Scholarship Commission, which is like Fulbright, but it's for people to British government funding for people from the Commonwealth to do so. And DFID fund us sort of 24 million a year, and obviously want proof that what we do impacts development. Now, we can show what we do impacts higher education, but whether or not that impacts development, I'm not sure that's our role. I mean, we had a conference a couple of weekends ago to try and talk these issues through. So I'm not sure it's our role, and that actually showing attribution is incredibly difficult. And the way, I'm sure this isn't true of USAID, but DFID tends to be run by white male economists who have a particular vision of the world, and that actually says, if you put this amount of money into higher education, it has this development impact. The primary education, it has this development impact. And even those who talk about, about qualitative research, and this is a bit harsh, okay, a bit harsh. Talk about qualitative research and talk about the participatory research. They still talk about cause and explanation. They don't talk about understanding, which would be a hermeneutic approach, or empowerment, which might be a critical theory approach. So they're still within this very, very positivist framework of cause-effect, and they don't understand what they're really talking about, many of them. Not all, of course. Sorry, you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, going back to the slide on the interests of the partners.
Yep.
I asked myself, what is the ultimate goal of MSPs? Because I was thinking civil society groups will have the interest of the users, but even if you look at yes,
really,
that is what I'm thinking.
They represent.
You believe that?
But even if you, if you look at them,
how wonderful!
Yeah. So what is the goal? Who is fighting for the users? With your rural development, background.
Okay, this is another seminar. Anytime, I'd love to. I've moved hugely in, I think, the last 2 or 3 years to a position where I think, okay, this is now Commonwealth Telecommunications organisation speak. The market will take care of the majority. Mm-hmm. So we have to make sure that the market functions as effectively as possible. And so regulatory environments and things like that are really important. So that's part of what I'm doing at CTO. But the other is we have to recognise that the majority isn't everybody, and the size of that majority varies hugely. And if you look at any ICT4D indicator you want to take, inequalities are much greater now than they were 10 years ago. And the ITU report on least developed countries, if you haven't read it, is an absolute must. I mean, it shows at a country scale, absolutely, LDCs along here, developed world there, developing world there. The inequalities now are much greater than they were. So where I think multi-stakeholder partnerships come in is in delivering for those needs. And so you have to have a broker or a visionary or a group of people who actually can understand and see how that can work. And I think one of the best ways is through, let's talk about getting innovative solutions for rural areas. Because the private sector isn't going to invest. They're not going to make any money out of it. However, it's a really interesting research challenge. But how do we deliver effective, good value for money solutions? The universal service funds, part of government, have a huge amount of money that in many instances there's a lot of uncertainty how to use it. Governments have an interest in rolling out to as many of their people as possible. The private sector has an interest in expanding their markets as widely as possible, be it mobile operators or not. So there is a coalition of interest committed to developing and delivering effective solutions for rural areas. That is where you need to have a good broker who can bring those interests together, get people to agree on shared outcomes, and deliver them effectively. And so that is, our plan in the CTO is to broker 2 of these multi-stakeholder partners. We're not very ambitious, but 2 of those a year, and because I see we see ourselves as filling that gap that I don't think anyone else is doing really well, and it will be helping them, it will be managing them through the whole process, helping them set up a good project management office, which will vary where it is, having the involvement and the leadership, and then actually being godfather or godmother to it throughout the process, so holding people to account in quarterly or even every 2 months meetings, and seeing it through in the long term. I mean, actually my slides didn't say anything about the time these things take. The World Economic Forum report is a lot about time, because they can't be done overnight. And one of the private sector interests is you've got to, particularly if you're looking at the business end, which you say we want to be rather than the CSR end, you've got to show quarterly returns. So you've got to build into this whole process quick wins. But this market taking care of the majority, and just create the structures to enable the market to function as effectively as possible. But then in the old days, I think the state would have provided, but we're in a low tax regime. And actually, as I argued earlier, ICT4D can't just be done by the state, because you need the technical expertise of the private sector. So you actually create those multi-stakeholder partnerships specifically to fill that gap. And we're working on particularly people with disabilities. It's not just spatial, it's people with disabilities. Other people are working on gender issues, but the most marginalised. Because if we don't, we're building up a recipe for massive challenges in terms of inequality in the future. So that was a bit impassioned, wasn't it?
That's why we're all here. Question for you then on multi-stakeholder partnerships as CTO or as you've done recently. If you can't necessarily or don't really know one that you could name that you think is successful, which ones have you been a part of that you felt the proudest of?
Infundo, without any question of doubt. And quite simply because the review we did showed we had wonderful comments from our African partners, which said we were the best of our kind in the donor community, and that was in our report. Yet DFID closed us down because they didn't actually. There were certain people in DFID who felt that partnerships weren't necessarily the most effective way of delivering development assistance, and there were partnerships were just projects, and so we failed. I talk about failures. In Infundo, I'd assumed that because we existed and we were an initiative from our Prime Minister's office, people wanted us. Big mistake. So I didn't spend enough time embedding what we did internally within the Department for International Development. Big mistake. The way our funding was structured, we had to work with country offices. And although I spent a lot of time trying to embed what we were doing with the country offices, they were completely focusing at that time on generating budgetary support mechanisms, and whoever first created Infundo called it a project. So we weren't ever a project. Partnerships are not projects. They're something completely different, and that we didn't get through. So and that's partly why I'm so, and maybe too much, I emphasise communication. You saw on that slide. I think it's always forgotten, and from my experience, it's hugely. But I think we tried to do something. It's over a decade ago now. And still proud. I'm still proud of it. I even though it was sort of after I left, it was shut down as quickly as possible. Maybe because I was too successful, too dangerous. No, it's certainly not too successful, but too dangerous. And the products we delivered were good, and they were lasting. And we were at the time. And the comments about being under-theorised and reinventing the wheel were as true of us as they were of others. But at least we tried to see what else was out there and try to work with others and try and learn from them.
must say that I've been enjoying your presentation, not only because of your style of presentation and delivery, but also the fact that going back over the partnership activities that I've been involved with, everything what you're saying rings clear and true. The importance of communication, the importance of understanding each other's needs out of the partnership, the ability to wait for the fullness of time for the outcomes from the partnership as opposed to
I still don't think we've got the attribution sorted out, and none of us are good on that.
Yeah, well, there is that for sure. I'm thinking about a partnership that we've been involved in now. It's about 4 years apart from the first go at something that became an absolute failure, and a second go, which has been quite successful and continues to serve both parties very nicely going forward for the partnership. In terms of the civil society part of it, we don't really get down to that level. I mean, it's not part of the relationship and so forth. So I think this is very much true. But what's different between the first go and the second go is that in the first go we had hopes that that we were going to get certain things out of it and that we could work together and so forth. And in the second go, I think both parties recognize that you must have a much clearer roadmap, and where each of us might get off the train if it's not serving our individual.
What kind of project management mechanisms did you use? That was it sort of, I don't know what. Is there a actually it's not really. Is there a standard USAID project management protocol that everyone has to follow?
If only.
No,
because DIFID used to be log frame, and it's now going for these business cases plus log frame. And some people use Prince 2. I
think actually USAID was the first agency to adopt the log frame, but they deserted it about 15 years ago or something.
So it's back again now.
But I mean, you asked what am I proud of? I mean, and maybe it follows this directly. Actually having a chart. So what we came up with was effectively a matrix like this. That you have demand partners and supply partners, you have contributions and expectations. And if you think about the resourcing and everything you need in that kind of quite simple fourfold matrix, it could be really helpful. And you know, obviously under demand partners there are lots of, and all of these there are lots of others. So it's not meant to be exclusive. It's just meant to be indicative. And so you, for example, then build up, touch on demand and supply side. You know, the end beneficiaries will be local communities, people with disabilities, teachers, health workers, and then you have the different kinds of funding agency, private sector. So you actually have to develop a really clear structure that you decide how it fits together. And so, for example, I think we came up at the time, so this is going back to Infundo, 5 kinds of main partnership contributions of human resources, physical ICT resources, social networks, infrastructures, and sheer money. And then recognising that there would be a different set of benefits around corporate identity, networking opportunities, economic returns, R&D, which I think these apply pretty much across others as well. And you actually then drill down into this level of detail and building up your kind of partnership framework.
Actually, going back to that, just before there, on the contribution side, the case with this partnership, I'm thinking about corporate identity is the contribution. There's part of the contribution. It's the branding that really has been very intoxicating for the clients, the people we're working with.
But again, communications is important there, so you need to get that out.
Yeah.
A government or private sector partner can commit, but if that's not visible,
right.
Which is why bodies like the World Economic Forum are actually so good in terms of getting that visibility.
Should point out that we do have at least one ringer in the crowd here. This is Noreen Janis. She's the USAID end of the partnership with Intel Corporation and Cisco. So,
who I work. I think the companies I work most closely with are Microsoft, Cisco, and Intel. So
the 3 kings of international development,
Right.
for better or for worse.
As a matter of fact, I have a direct question on that. I hope I don't put you on the spot.
Well, we can switch off that if necessary.
That's right.
I've been diplomatic. No, go on.
I met you for the first time back when I'm looking at your bio. When you first started with the UNESCO project, I met you in about 2007 in a conference in California in support of one of these.
Well, that was the GAID thing, was it?
Yeah, and so I'm just wondering, because I've learned a lot since that year to present time regarding partnerships within AID and how we're working with these private sector firms. So wondering, I mean, where were you then in your thinking to this, which is fabulously great? So
I was still. If you want my comments on GAID, you know GAID's resurrecting itself.
Oh.
And you should see my comments, or I know you can look at the GAID discuss list on
We
that.
need to turn off the camera before you laugh. Before you laugh so loudly.
GAID as an idea, I think, was good.
Global Alliance for ICTs in Development.
Yeah, GAID I think as an idea was good, but I just think it was weak because it wasn't even supported by its home agency did not support it.
It was trying to
do everything.
Yeah, and duplicate other. Anyway, let's sort of you're specifically where was I and about the companies. I think one of the really interesting things is the impact that the recession has had on changing mentality of major private sector players. So I think that whether that we can't ignore that, and the ways it's changed the drivers. I think one of the really interesting things about working with those three companies is the way they are fundamentally different in their corporate structure, the ways they operate, the identities and everything about them. Secondly, I think, and all of these are consistent. Secondly, I think there are some brilliant people in them who really are committed to development. I've got no qualms about that. I think the lesson I've learned that I wasn't so aware of is what I touched on earlier, is in much of my earlier work with them I was dealing with the CSR parts. Now CSR varies hugely, and I think one can draw, there are companies like Cisco, which I will name on record, that CSR is embedded in the very fabric of the organisation, and you've got brilliant people like Tay who this really matters for. At the other extreme, the companies I won't name, but you've got particularly banks who will sort of say, right, well, we'll give X% of our profits into a fund that for charitable purposes that people use, so it doesn't change the way, the fabric of the organisation. So I think understanding that and the way where different companies are on that line is really important. At that time, I didn't understand sufficiently the way companies were structured corporately and where the key nodes and buttons and that you had to push and everything are. And so even though I espoused the view that the business end of the company was the essential part to work with, I hadn't articulated it particularly clearly. And just recently, so I want to bring some of these companies into the CTO membership, which has primarily been telecom operators before, and actually, working at the really hard end and showing that there's a business case for them being involved. And very crudely, you spend this amount of money, you will get more than that in benefits, but it will have a development impact. That's something I've never done before, and I think is what we have to do. I still think my boss at the forum and I had rather different perspectives in this report that we wrote. I think the final version actually has my wording of it, but but toned down a little bit. I said, and I believe, and talking with people in these companies, they make no bones about it, that the private sector is only interested in two things ultimately. It's expanding the market and reducing input costs. So there's another seminar about the myths of mobile. There was a wonderful report just recently in the Star or something about all the benefits of mobile technologies in development, all the super things that have been done. There should be a parallel list, all the damage it's done. It's really nobody does that. But I think these companies are completely upfront about that, and that's part of the transparency. And governments still don't believe it. And so what we have to do is say, okay, accept these facts, and then work with that to achieve development impacts. And I think where I'm now, and I would never have said let the market take care of the majority before and therefore create the regulatory environments to enable that. I think that's hugely important. Make that work efficiently. For the foreseeable future, we've got that world. But actually bringing these partnerships to the bottom. I think some of the companies are brain dead. Microsoft is about two things. It's about, well, was until very recently. It was about an operating system and something called Microsoft Office. And actually, I've many discussions, and so I'm happy to put this on record because I've had it with them. That if it was really about education, it would call Microsoft Education, not Microsoft Office. Office has nothing to do with education at all. And they've got this huge program for education, which is primarily driven by getting computers in schools running Windows or whatever, and getting teachers to use Office software.
Highly effective, because now a real computer or a real education with ICT involves learning Microsoft Office.
Yes, or Open Office. But the really, and
No.
Yeah,
Microsoft
I know, it's okay. I think the shift to the cloud is really interesting, and something the CTO is working on is the security aspects of that, which I think are really tricky. And the cloud is in some ways a bit of a trick because there's always been a cloud, but I think. Yeah, I'm reading a really good book. I can't remember who wrote it, just on the plane coming over, about Microsoft, Apple, and Google. Arthur, some or other, it just came out this year. It's comparing all three companies, and if I was in Microsoft right now, I'd be really deeply scared. I think the future for Microsoft, if it doesn't change its whole way of business operations, and it's I've said publicly, I'll say in 5 years' time, no one will have desktops, and very few, only geeks will have these. I should have brought my little Huawei 7-inch media pad. When that is flexible, it just goes in your pocket and you don't crush it when you sit on it. That's the future. For many years I've been saying it was advice about that size, and now we have them. It's just a device to let you. And Akash, have you seen Akash?
Yeah.
I haven't touched one yet. But Kapil Sibal at GSMA in Barcelona was saying this is going to every university student. $35. That's what it's going to cost them. But multiply that, and then to every child in India. That's their vision.
Well, let us remember that the one device per child vision has been around for a while now.
Yeah. But the passion and the commitment, and then that this will become, then every child will have one, every family will have one, and that will be the way through which government services are going to be distributed across India, the whole Indian population. And that is, to me, deeply scary, but hearing the Indian government talk about this is interesting. But that's the future, and so it's a device connected to an infrastructure that anyone can do anything on, and as long as we have standards across them all, so they can all talk to each other. That is the future. That is here now, effectively. So if you're not if you're not part of that, and I don't see Microsoft as being part of that, really, and they haven't cracked the mobile device, they haven't the tablet. So sorry, it's a long answer to why I think Microsoft's in. I wouldn't. I'd love to turn the company around. I could do it. I can make Microsoft good. I can also yes.
You're on record.
See through walls. Good luck with that.
Well, we're just about run out of time, but thank you very much for coming. This has been a fabulous conversation. We will definitely take you up on your offer to come back and have more of these chats.
And if any of you are in London, thank you so much. I've enjoyed it, and it's, I'd like the conversation to carry